In the heart of the rugged mountains of Falconridge, a thick fog rolled over the dense forests as night fell. The wind howled through the trees, and the only sound louder than the wind was the pounding of hooves as Mitch rode through the forest, her heart racing with fear and adrenaline. Disguised as a man, Mitch had been running for weeks. Ever since her father's murder and the corrupt lord who had taken over their lands, she had been on the run. Disguising herself as a boy was the only way to survive in a world where women alone had little power. She had no choice but to fend for herself, always looking over her shoulder. Suddenly, an arrow whizzed through the air. Mitch barely had time to react before it pierced her shoulder, knocking her off her horse. The impact of the fall sent a jolt of pain through her body, but she knew she couldn't give up. She struggled to her feet, clutching her shoulder as her attackers closed in. Her vision blurred, and her strength began to fade as she stumbled through the forest, desperately trying to escape. Just as she thought she would lose consciousness, a figure emerged from the trees. A young man about her age, with dark hair and a serious expression. Without a word, he grabbed her arm and pulled her into the dense underbrush, hiding her from view. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder as her pursuers rode past them, unaware of where she had gone. Mitch held her breath, trying to ignore the throbbing pain in her shoulder as they waited in silence. The young man didn't say a word, his grip on her arm firm but not unkind. After what felt like hours, the sound of horses faded into the distance. The young man finally let go of Mitch's arm and turned to look at her, his brow furrowed in concern. "You've been hit," he said, his voice low and calm. "Let me help." Mitch, still disguised as a boy, shook her head. "I'm fine," she muttered through gritted teeth, trying to hide the pain. She didn't want anyone to know her secret. But the young man wasn't convinced. He gently took her arm and led her to a small clearing nearby, where the moonlight filtered through the trees. As she sat down on a fallen log, he knelt beside her and inspected the arrow lodged in her shoulder. "This is bad," he said, his voice softening. "I need to remove it, or the wound will get worse." Reluctantly, Mitch nodded. She didn't have much of a choice. She couldn't continue on like this. The young man took a deep breath and carefully pulled out the arrow, doing his best to be gentle. Mitch winced in pain, but bit her lip, determined not to cry out. As he worked, the young man's eyes widened slightly. His fingers brushed against her skin, and in that moment, he realized the truth. She wasn't a boy at all. You're a woman," he whispered, his eyes meeting hers in shock. Mitch's heart raced as she saw the recognition in his eyes. She had been found out, but instead of reacting with anger or suspicion, the young man, Carl, looked at her with a mix of surprise and admiration. "I won't say a word," he assured her quietly, "but you shouldn't be out here alone." After tending to Mitch's wound, Carl offered her a place to rest in his small cabin hidden deep within the woods. It wasn't much, just a modest home with the basics needed for survival, but it was a refuge from the dangers of the world outside. Mitch, still wary of him, hesitated, but exhaustion and pain eventually won out. She agreed, though she kept her guard up. As the days passed, Mitch and Carl spent time together, and though she was careful not to let her defenses down completely, she began to trust him. Carl was quiet, respectful, and seemed genuinely concerned for her well-being. He didn't pry into her past, though it was clear he had his own secrets as well. For Carl, Mitch was an enigma. He had never encountered anyone like her, a woman brave enough to disguise herself as a man and survive alone in the wilderness. Her determination intrigued him, but it was her strength that earned his respect. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Mitch spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you help me?" Carl looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've lived alone for so long. I suppose I've forgotten what it's like to care about someone else. But when I saw you in danger, I couldn't just walk away." Mitch's heart softened at his words. She hadn't expected kindness from a stranger, least of all someone like Carl, who seemed to be as haunted by his past as she was. The days turned into weeks, and as Mitch's wound healed, so did her trust in Carl. Their bond, once fragile, grew stronger with each passing day. They shared stories of their pasts, though Mitch was careful not to reveal too much about her true identity or the circumstances that had forced her to flee. Carl, in turn, told her of his own troubled history, of a family he had lost and a life he had left behind. As they worked side by side, gathering firewood, hunting for food, and keeping the cabin in order, something deeper began to stir between them. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance, a brush of the hand, but it was undeniable. Carl found himself drawn to Mitch's strength and resilience, while Mitch admired Carl's quiet wisdom and steady presence. Neither of them spoke of the growing feelings between them, but it hung in the air, unspoken and undeniable. One day, as Mitch was exploring the forest nearby, she stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. Hidden in the underbrush, she found a piece of fabric, a banner with the insignia of the corrupt lord who had taken her family's lands. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized that her enemies were still searching for her. She rushed back to the cabin, her mind racing. She needed to leave. She couldn't put Carl in danger. But when she arrived, Carl was waiting for her, his face etched with concern. "What? Wrong?" he asked, sensing her distress. Mitch hesitated for a moment, then told him the truth about her family, her father's murder, and the reason she had been on the run. She expected Carl to be shocked or even angry, but instead, he listened quietly, his expression unreadable. "I see," he said after a long pause. "You've been through a lot." Mitch looked away, feeling vulnerable. "I didn't want to drag you into this. I'll leave as soon as I can." But Carl shook his head. "You're not going anywhere, Mitch. Not alone. If your enemies are still after you, you'll need help. And I'm not going to let you face this on your own." Mitch's heart swelled with emotion at his words. She had never asked for anyone's help before. She had always relied on herself. But now, with Carl standing by her side, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do this alone. As the days passed, Mitch and Carl prepared for the inevitable confrontation with her enemies. Carl taught Mitch how to use a bow and arrow, how to defend herself in close combat, and how to set traps to protect the cabin. Together, they devised a plan to lure her pursuers into the forest, where they would have the advantage. But as they trained and planned, their bond grew even deeper. The long hours spent working side by side, the quiet moments by the fire, the shared glances that lingered just a little too long. It all built into something neither of them could ignore. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Carl turned to Mitch, his expression serious. "I never thought I'd meet someone like you," he said quietly. "You've changed everything for me." Mitch's heart raced as she met his gaze. "You've changed everything for me too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Without another word, Carl stepped closer, his hand gently brushing against her cheek. Mitch closed her eyes as his lips met hers in a soft, tender kiss. It was a moment of vulnerability and trust, a moment that sealed their bond. As they pulled away, both of them knew that no matter what happened next, they would face it together. Their love had grown out of hardship and danger, but it was strong, and it would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, Mitch and Carl prepared to face the storm that was coming, knowing that no matter what happened, they had each other. Their journey was just beginning, but with love and trust on their side, they were ready for whatever the future held. The days passed with an eerie calm. Mitch and Carl trained relentlessly, their partnership growing stronger with each shared moment. As the final confrontation with Mitch's enemies loomed closer, they spent more and more time together, talking, planning, and finding solace in each other's presence. One evening, while sitting beside the flickering fire in Carl's cabin, Mitch gazed into the flames, her thoughts heavy. "I never imagined my life would lead here," she said softly. "Fleeing from my home, disguised as someone I'm not. It feels like everything I've known is slipping away." Carl watched her, his eyes filled with understanding. "You're not alone anymore, Mitch," he reminded her. "We'll fight this together. and when it's over, you'll be free to live the life you deserve." Mitch smiled slightly, appreciating his unwavering support. "And what about you, Carl? What do you want when this is all over?" Carl hesitated, his jaw tightening slightly. "I've been running for so long," he confessed, his voice low. "I thought I could live out here in Falcon Ridge, away from the world, but meeting you, it's made me want something more." Mitch's heart skipped a beat as their eyes met. She knew he was talking about more than just survival. The unspoken connection between them was undeniable, and it scared her just as much as it thrilled her. "We'll find a way," Carl added, his hand reaching out to cover hers. "We'll get through this. Together." Mitch nodded, feeling a renewed sense of hope despite the danger that loomed ahead. She had never thought she would find someone she could rely on so deeply, but Carl had become more than just an ally. He had become the person she trusted with her heart. As Mitch and Carl continued their preparations, a surprise visitor arrived at the cabin. A grizzled man named Marcus, someone from Carl's past. Mitch was immediately on guard, unsure of Marcus's intentions, but Carl greeted him with a mixture of caution and familiarity. "Marcus," Carl said warily, "it's been a long time." "Too long," Marcus replied with a grim smile. He looked around the cabin, his eyes lingering on Mitch. "I hear you're in some trouble. Figured I'd offer a hand." Mitch crossed her arms, skeptical of the sudden offer. "Why would you help us?" she asked, her voice firm. She had learned not to trust easily, and she didn't want Carl's past to complicate things. Marcus shrugged, leaning against the doorframe. "I owe Carl a favor, and besides, I'm no fan of the corrupt lords running this land. If they're after you, it's only a matter of time before they come for the rest of us." Carl explained that Marcus had been a former comrade, someone who had walked away from the dangerous life they had once shared. Despite her reservations, Mitch agreed to accept Marcus's help, knowing they would need every advantage they could get. Over the next few days, Marcus proved to be a valuable ally. He had knowledge of the local terrain and suggested new strategies that would give them the upper hand. As they worked together, Mitch found herself slowly warming to Marcus, though she remained cautious. With Marcus's assistance, their plan to lure Mitch's pursuers into the forest grew more elaborate. They set traps, dug trenches, and prepared for the inevitable confrontation. The quiet tension before the battle built with each passing day, but Mitch found comfort in knowing Carl and Marcus were by her side. The day of reckoning finally arrived. As the sun began to set over the mountains, Mitch's enemies, led by a ruthless mercenary captain, made their way into the forest, following a false trail Mitch and Carl had laid for them. Carl, Marcus, and Mitch were hidden, ready to spring their trap. The forest was eerily quiet as they watched the mercenaries approach. Mitch's heart pounded in her chest, her bow clutched tightly in her hands. She had trained for this moment, but the reality of facing her enemies head-on filled her with both fear and determination. At Carl's signal, the traps were sprung. A series of sharp wooden stakes shot up from the ground, taking out several of the mercenaries. The rest of the group scrambled, momentarily disoriented. Mitch and Carl launched arrows from their hidden positions, picking off the attackers one by one. But the mercenaries were relentless, and soon the forest was filled with the sounds of battle. Carl fought with a fierce intensity, his sword flashing in the dim light as he protected Mitch's flank. Marcus, with his years of experience, fought like a man possessed, taking down enemies with brutal efficiency. Mitch, despite the fear coursing through her veins, fought alongside them, her arrows flying true. The battle raged on, and for a moment, it seemed as though they might be overwhelmed. But then, just as all seemed lost, the tide of battle turned in their favor. With a final push, Carl and Marcus cut down the remaining mercenaries, leaving the forest littered with their fallen enemies. Breathing heavily, Mitch looked around at the aftermath of the fight. It was over. She had faced her pursuers head-on and emerged victorious. The battle had taken its toll, both physically and emotionally. Mitch's shoulder wound, though healed, ached from the strain of combat, and the weight of everything she had been through finally began to settle in. Carl, sensing her weariness, approached her after the battle, his expression soft. "You did it," he said quietly. "You're free now." Mitch nodded, but tears welled in her eyes. The victory felt bittersweet. Yes, she had won, but at what cost? She had lost her family, her home, and her old life. Though she had found Carl, the pain of her past still weighed heavily on her heart. "I don't know what comes next," Mitch admitted, her voice trembling. "Everything I've known is gone." Carl reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands. "We'll figure it out together," he said softly. "You don't have to face this alone anymore." Mitch leaned into his touch, finding comfort in his presence. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel hope for the future, whatever it might bring. As the days passed, Mitch and Carl began to rebuild their lives. Together, they made plans to leave the forest and start anew, far away from the corruption and violence that had plagued them for so long. Their bond, forged in the fires of battle, and the day of reckoning finally arrived. As the sun began to set over the mountains, Mitch's enemies, led by a ruthless mercenary captain, made their way into the forest, following a false trail Mitch and Carl had laid for them. Carl, Marcus, and Mitch were hidden, ready to spring their trap. The forest was eerily quiet as they watched the mercenaries approach. Mitch's heart pounded in her chest, her bow clutched tightly in her hands. She had trained for this moment, but the reality of facing her enemies head-on filled her with both fear and determination. At Carl's signal, the traps were sprung. A series of sharp wooden stakes shot up from the ground, taking out several of the mercenaries. The rest of the group scrambled, momentarily disoriented. Mitch and Carl launched arrows from their hidden positions, picking off the attackers one by one. But the mercenaries were relentless, and soon the forest was filled with the sounds of battle. Carl fought with a fierce intensity, his sword flashing in the dim light as he protected Mitch's flank. Marcus, with his years of experience, fought like a man possessed, taking down enemies with brutal efficiency. Mitch, despite the fear coursing through her veins, fought alongside them, her arrows flying true. The battle raged on, and for a moment, it seemed as though they might be overwhelmed. But then, just as all seemed lost, the tide of battle turned in their favor. With a final push, Carl and Marcus cut down the remaining mercenaries, leaving the forest littered with their fallen enemies. Breathing heavily, Mitch looked around at the aftermath of the fight. It was over. She had faced her pursuers head-on and emerged victorious. The battle had taken its toll, both physically and emotionally. Mitch's shoulder wound, though healed, ached from the strain of combat, and the weight of everything she had been through finally began to settle in. Carl, sensing her weariness, approached her after the battle, his expression soft. "You did it," he said quietly. "You're free now." Mitch nodded, but tears welled in her eyes. The victory felt bittersweet. Yes, hardship grew stronger with each passing day. Mitch had found something she had never expected. A partner who understood her, stood by her side, and loved her for who she truly was. Though the road ahead was uncertain, Mitch knew one thing for sure. She and Carl would face whatever came next together, their hearts intertwined in a love that had survived the greatest of trials. As Mitch and Carl prepared to leave Falconridge behind, the question of their future lingered in the air. They had spent months surviving, battling enemies, and forging an unbreakable bond. But now that the immediate danger had passed, they faced a new challenge. What did their lives look like moving forward? One evening, as they sat by the fire in Carl's cabin for what would likely be the last time, Mitch voiced the question that had been on her mind. "Where do we go from here?" Carl turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know," he admitted, "but wherever we go, we'll go together." Mitch smiled at his words, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She had never thought she would find a love as strong as the one she had found with Carl, a love built on trust, respect, and shared experiences. They spoke late into the night, making plans for a future free of the violence and fear that had dominated their pasts. They talked of traveling to distant lands, of building a life far away from the shadows of their former lives. As dawn broke over the mountains, Mitch and Carl knew that the hardest part of their journey was behind them. Together, they had faced unimaginable challenges, and together, they would forge a new path, one filled with love, hope, and the promise of a better tomorrow. With the decision made, Mitch and Carl packed up the last of their belongings, ready to leave Falcon Ridge behind for good. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Mitch felt a sense of peace. She and Carl had fought so hard to survive, and now they were walking away from the life of danger that had consumed them. Their destination was the coastal city of Silverport, a bustling trade hub far from the corruption of the lords who had once pursued Mitch. It was a place where they could start anew, free from their pasts. As they walked through the forest one last time, hand in hand, Mitch took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. The forest had once felt like a prison, but now it was just a memory. Carl glanced at her, his eyes filled with quiet affection. "Silverport will be different," he said. "It's not like the places we've known." Mitch nodded, grateful for the chance to rebuild her life with Carl by her side. "I'm ready for something new," she replied, her voice steady. "As long as we're together, I'm not afraid." As they approached the outskirts of Falcon Ridge, Mitch felt a bittersweet pang. Despite everything that had happened, this place had been their refuge, their battleground, and the place where she had found Carl. Now, as they stepped into the unknown, she knew it was time to let go of the past and embrace the future. Silverport was unlike anything Mitch had ever seen. The city buzzed with life, its cobblestone streets filled with merchants, sailors, and travelers from distant lands. Ships docked at the busy harbor, their sails flapping in the wind as goods were unloaded and sold at the markets. The air smelled of salt water, spices, and the promise of new beginnings. Mitch and Carl settled into a small, cozy inn near the harbor. It wasn't much, but it was their first step toward building a new life. For the first time in months, they weren't constantly looking over their shoulders, waiting for an attack. They were free. Carl quickly found work as a blacksmith, using his skills to craft weapons and tools for the sailors and merchants. Mitch, unsure of her own path, took time to explore the city, learning its rhythms and getting to know the people. She found herself drawn to the sea, spending hours watching the waves crash against the docks, wondering what the future held. One afternoon, while sitting by the shore, Carl joined her, his hands stained with soot from the forge. "What's on your mind?" he asked, sitting beside her. Mitch smiled, her eyes still on the horizon. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've spent so much time running and fighting. I'm not sure what to do now that I don't have to." Carl chuckled softly. "I know the feeling, but we've earned this, Mitch. Whatever you want to do next, we'll figure it out." Mitch turned to him, her heart swelling with love. "I want to build a life with you," she said simply, "whatever that looks like." Carl's expression softened, and he took her hand in his. "Then that's what we'll do." As Mitch and Carl began to settle into their new life, the peace they had found was soon tested. Rumors began to circulate through the city. Whispers of a powerful merchant lord who was causing unrest among the trade guilds. His name was Lord Davin, a man with a ruthless reputation and a thirst for power. Mitch, wary of getting involved in any more conflicts, tried to ignore the rumors. But when Carl returned from the forge one evening with a grave expression, she knew something was wrong. "Lord Davin's been making moves," Carl explained. "He's buying out smaller businesses, forcing people to sell at a loss. The city's on edge." Mitch frowned, her instincts kicking in. "What does that mean for us?" Carl shook his head. "I'm not sure, but it feels like something's brewing." Over the next few weeks, tensions in Silverport escalated. Protests broke out in the streets, and it became clear that Lord Davin's influence was spreading. Mitch and Carl tried to stay out of it, focusing on their new life together, but it became harder to ignore the unrest that was creeping into every corner of the city. One evening, while walking home from the market, Mitch overheard a conversation that chilled her to the bone. Two men were talking in hushed voices, discussing a plan to take over the harbor, a plan that involved violence and intimidation. Mitch's heart raced as she hurried back to the inn, her mind racing with questions. She knew they couldn't stay on the sidelines forever, but after everything they had been through, the last thing she wanted was to get dragged into another conflict. When she told Carl what she had heard, he listened carefully, his brow furrowed. "We need to be careful," he said. "Lord Davin's men are dangerous. If they find out we're getting involved..." Mitch nodded, understanding the risks. But as she looked into Carl's eyes, she knew they couldn't just stand by and watch the city fall into chaos. They had fought too hard for their freedom to let it slip away now. "We'll figure it out," she said, her voice determined. "Together." As the weeks passed, the tension in Silverport reached a breaking point. Lord Davin's grip on the city tightened, and the harbor became a battleground for control. Sailors, merchants, and townsfolk alike were drawn into the conflict, and it became clear that a reckoning was coming. Mitch and Carl, despite their efforts to stay out of the fray, found themselves caught in the middle. Carl's blacksmithing business was thriving, but with the harbor under siege, shipments of materials were delayed, and tempers flared among the workers. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the inn, Mitch voiced the question that had been gnawing at her for weeks. "Do you think we made a mistake coming here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carl looked at her, his eyes filled with concern. "No," he said firmly. "We didn't know this would happen, but we're here now, and we'll face whatever comes next." Mitch nodded, but the weight of the city's turmoil was heavy on her shoulders. She had finally found peace with Carl, but now that peace was slipping away, she couldn't help but wonder if they would ever truly be free from the shadows of their pasts. As the city braced for the coming storm, Mitch and Carl knew they would have to make a choice: fight for their new life in Silverport or leave it all behind once again. The decision would shape their future, but one thing was certain. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The streets of Silverport erupted into chaos as Lord Davin's men made their move. Armed mercenaries stormed the harbor, clashing with the city's defenders in a brutal fight for control. Mitch and Carl watched from the safety of their inn, but it was clear that the conflict was spreading. When a group of armed men arrived at the inn, demanding supplies and threatening the innkeeper, Mitch and Carl knew they couldn't stay hidden any longer. Carl grabbed his sword, and Mitch armed herself with a bow, ready to defend the people they had come to care about. As they fought off the attackers, Mitch's mind raced. They had come to Silverport for a fresh start, but now they were back in the middle of a war. She couldn't help but wonder if they would ever find the peace they were searching for. But as Carl fought by her side, his eyes filled with determination, Mitch realized that it didn't matter where they were or what they were fighting. As long as they had each other, they would always find a way to survive. The battle for Silverport was long and bloody, but in the end, Lord Davin's forces were defeated. The city was left scarred, but its people were resilient, and slowly, life began to return to normal. Mitch and Carl, exhausted but victorious, stood on the docks, watching the sun rise over the harbor. The air was still, the city quiet for the first time in weeks. "We did it," Carl said softly, his arm around Mitch's shoulders. Mitch nodded, her heart full. "We did," she agreed. As they stood together, watching the dawn of a new day, Mitch knew that their journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, but as long as they were together, they would face it all with courage and love. Was far from finished, but for now, they had found peace. And that, Mitch thought with a smile, was more than enough. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.